Welcome back, Exiles. Today we are diving deep into one of the most exciting yet daunting changes coming with Path of Exile 2, the revamped difficulty curve. GGG has completely reimagined how we approach challenges from the early levels to endgame, and today we're going to break it all down chapter by chapter. If you've been frustrated by the power spikes or found certain boss fights to be a walk in the park, well, buckle up. Path of Exile 2 is shaking things up in a big way, so let's get into it. In the original Path of Exile, the early game has always had a relatively smooth progression, especially after a few patches of rebalancing. The first few acts usually serve as a tutorial for players, gently easing them into the game's complex systems. Path of Exile 2, however, flips this idea on its head. Gone are the days of breezing through the first couple of acts. Now the early game is a challenge on its own. From the moment you step into the campaign, you'll notice a significant shift in pacing. Enemies are smarter, more aggressive, and they hit harder. But more importantly, they are varied. You are no longer just cutting through waves of mindless zombies or sandspitters. Enemies now have more advanced AI, meaning positioning, dodging, and understanding attack patterns are key. Even at level 1, you are already facing foes that require you to think. What GGG has done here is remove the autopilot many of us have been guilty of engaging in during early levels. You have to respect the game's mechanics right from the start, whether it's learning to manage your health and mana flasks or adapting to the rhythm of attack animations. You're never safe, even in the early game. Now here is where the new difficulty curve really takes off, the mid-game. You know how in Path of Exile 1, acts 5 to 10 could feel like a repetitive grind, just something to push through to get to mapping without engaging your thinker in any way. Well, in Path of Exile 2, that's no longer the case. First off, from the footage that's available, gear scaling seems much more gradual. In the past, you could rely on just a couple of gear upgrades or sometimes even unique items to boost your survivability or damage. Now, however, itemization requires more careful thought. Every upgrade matters, and you can't just slap on any old weapon or armor and expect it to carry you through the next 10 levels. You will need to invest in crafting, spend gold at the vendor in town, and really hunt for specific affixes to keep pace with the rising challenge. Enemy mechanics also take a serious leap. Bosses have a much broader range of attacks with telegraphed AoEs and more dynamic phases that force you to react quickly. We're talking multi-phase boss fights, unique environments that test your positioning and on-the-fly thinking. These bosses aren't just HP sponges, they are each a puzzle on their own. For the mid-game, success comes from mastering the core mechanics of your build, knowing your skills and skill combos, ascendancy choices, and most importantly, your defensive layers. There's no more brain-dead rushing to endgame. You need to understand your character's strengths and weaknesses to progress through the campaign. Alright, here's where things get really interesting. Let's talk about the late-game difficulty. Now, while GGG has kept a tight lid on the specifics of the final acts, endgame bosses and endgame systems, we can already start piecing together what the late game might look like based on everything we've seen so far. First, let's start with the complexity of enemy mechanics. If we take the ramped up AI and layered attacks from the mid-game and crank them up even further, we're likely looking at a huge escalation in enemy behavior. Late-game mobs might not just hit harder, they could synergize with their environment or each other in ways we've never seen before. Imagine entire zones where the terrain is actively working against you. Maybe poisonous clouds drift across the battlefield, forcing you to keep moving, or mobs that heal each other unless you prioritize your targets correctly. It's also fair to speculate that late-game map bosses won't just be bigger and badder versions of mid-game enemies. Instead, we could see those same bosses with more intricate multi-phase mechanics where their abilities and attack patterns change dynamically as the fight progresses. Think about the potential for environmental shifts mid-fight, like an area that morphs or collapses, forcing you to adapt on the fly. We could even see boss fights that involve more than one boss at a time, tag teaming you with complementary abilities, making them nearly impossible to brute force. In that case, build adaptability becomes very important. If there is one thing we can expect, it's that Path of Exile 2 will demand more from our builds than ever before, especially in the late game. Gone are the days where a single strategy or build can carry you all the way through. Instead, I think GGG might be pushing players to create multi-layered builds that can handle a variety of situations. Late-game enemies might have resistances or mechanics that punish specific types of playstyles, forcing you to rethink the meta entirely. Or maybe even go as far as changing your main damage-dealing ability for that act completely, which will be easy enough to do with the new weapon swap mechanic that automatically changes your skill tree to be ready for new challenges. For example, imagine bosses that heavily punish players relying solely on burst damage by entering invulnerable states when their health dips below a certain threshold. Or perhaps a fight where a single hit from the boss can completely disable certain abilities, forcing you to switch tactics mid-battle. The idea of GGG introducing boss counters to certain builds isn't far-fetched, especially considering their push towards creating a more diverse skill ecosystem. We might even see mechanics where failing to adapt means you lose access to core parts of your build for the duration of the fight in form of a permanent resistance on a boss. What about damage scaling and survivability? Players will need to fine-tune every stat, offense, defense, and utility, because one misstep in optimization could mean the difference between victory and an endless death loop. We might see more emphasis on rare crafting materials that only drop from late game or even pinnacle bosses, encouraging a more grind-intensive approach to perfecting your build. It wouldn't be surprising if GGG introduces late-game content that requires you to not only be skilled, but also to meticulously craft the perfect setup for these challenges. Finally, let's not forget about the post-story endgame content. It's likely that the new Atlas system will push the difficulty curve beyond just the core acts. Pinnacle bosses like those introduced in the first game will probably become even more intricate and terrifying in Path of Exile 2. If we are speculating, it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine entirely new layers to mapping, like zones that have rotating modifiers or time challenges where you are constantly under pressure, or maybe we'll face Uber versions of already challenging bosses with enhanced mechanics that force us to adapt all over again. The truth is, GGG has only given us a taste of what's to come in Path of Exile 2's late game. But what if what we've seen so far is an indication we are in for a brutal yet rewarding experience? The endgame won't just be a numbers game, it's going to be about game knowledge, precision, and most of all, adaptability. Finally, we arrive at the very endgame stage. GGG has probably taken what we know about Path of Exile's mapping system and supercharged it. But with that increase in scope comes an increase in feel-good depth. The Atlas system will probably be even more dynamic, and with Path of Exile 2 there is a heightened sense of progression. Pinnacle bosses will bring some of the most difficult encounters we've ever seen, especially under the circumstance that every boss during the campaign already feels like a full-blown Path of Exile Pinnacle boss. The thing is, the difficulty curve doesn't just plateau in the endgame, it continues to climb, incrementally but noticeably, pushing your build to the absolute limits. Endgame bosses test everything you've learned. Your positioning, flask management, build knowledge, and gear optimization will all be put under the microscope. This is where the true difficulty of Path of Exile 2 becomes clear. It's not just about survival, it's about thriving in chaos. You're constantly adapting to new mechanics, dodging screen-filling abilities, and managing boss phases that can shift in an instant. But here's the beauty of it. You've made it this far, you're prepared. The new difficulty curve has taught you patience, precision, and resilience. You will have faced walls and overcome them, and now the final challenge lies ahead. Whether you defeat these upcoming challenges and fulfill your destiny is not just a matter of raw stats, but of strategy and mastery. So there you have it, Exiles. The new difficulty curve in Path of Exile 2 is a journey, not just a grind. Every act feels meaningful, every boss fight is a test, and every triumph comes from skill and strategy, not just raw power. GGG has crafted a system that pushes players to engage deeply with the game's mechanics from start to finish. And honestly, I couldn't be more excited to dive into this revamped world. As always, thanks for watching, and drop a like or a comment down below if this has helped you hype up for the challenge ahead. And if you like content similar to this, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time.